Well, that's one of the reasons we want to have these kind of conversations, is to really open up this world for people and show them these are the people who are in Shenyun, who are involved as parents, as friends, as family, the performers, musicians, whoever they may be. This is who they are, and that's what life is like. And just really make it way more transparent for people to see who these people are. Thinking about like how savvy they are to be able to pinpoint these things. Do you think that the CCP, this is happening, sounds like at a provincial level, at a ministerial level, do you think they're getting help? Do they have like consultants or PR firms in the West that are telling them, hey, this is what you need to do to take it down?
We don't know for sure, but I think it's pretty obvious to look at their methodology and determine that they've got to have someone, a firm, somebody helping them with this. We know that when the persecution first started back in 1999, that the Chinese regime did have, unfortunately, the help from Western PR firms. And it was very obvious because when the persecution first started, they were all over the place. I remember one of their officials going on Ted Koppel when he had the Nightline show, and Ted Koppel asked him point blank, why are you cracking down on this group? And the guy was like shifting in his chair, and he's like, they're disrupting traffic. And Ted Koppel's like, you got to do better than that. I forget exactly what he said, but he's like, that's ridiculous. And it took him several months, but then fairly quickly, or instantaneously, they immediately had a cult narrative. And they had all these narratives lined up, and they started hitting Falun Gong with that. So clearly somebody, some firm, and we know now that there was this Western PR firm, was helping them with that. You see the same thing here. They've tried all kinds of things with Shenyun. It hasn't worked. It's largely failed. And then suddenly they have this burst, just in the last 6 months, 8 months, where they're really laser focused on these key propaganda issues. I would be shocked if they don't have some help from somebody who's savvy in PR in the West, helping them. Nothing else makes sense.
Looking at how they take a positive and turn it into a negative, I'm seeing a parallel here between how they attacked Falun Gong in the beginning. At first, they were saying Falun Gong is this just really deeply Chinese thing. This can represent us, and Qigong in general. And during the boom in the 70s and 80s, here's was something, China's contribution to the world, the Qigong boom. And this is something that can really bring out that's both our values and something that Western science does not have right now. And Falun Gong was at the tail end of the Qigong boom and bringing out these ideas that were very, very deeply Chinese. And then they say, no, Falun Gong is anti-China. It's an anti-China force. And then same with Shenyun. We're performing 5,000 years of civilization, the stories and legends, the values of traditional China. And they're saying we're anti-China. Of course, what they probably mean is we're anti-CCP, which even that's not really our mission.
Right.
It's just kind of a byproduct.
Right.
So for you, like having gone on this journey from the day one when the persecution started, and I wasn't involved in Falun Gong or Shenyun back then, but you were there on the ground. Seeing that, does it feel like a rerun right now? Like it's happening again in a different way?
I think that's exactly what's happening. That's exactly what's happening. In the tactic, like you just said, the reversal tactic, in the idea that they suddenly become laser focused on key propaganda issues that they're going to think are going to really resonate. Back then it was, stumbling around, oh, cult, that works in the West, let's call them that. Now it's harming children, let's call them that. And so it very much feels that way. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Again, it's interesting you mentioned that because just for me personally, now that you say that, looking at sort of my, I guess, both intellectual and emotional response to what's happening, I've been involved in this 25 years. It is very similar to those times we were sitting on the couch in the apartment in the Upper West Side of Manhattan back in the late part of 99, 2000, where it was clear there was an onslaught of propaganda that was dumping into a void here. And we were kind of trying to cover, it was almost like a little bit like whack-a-mole, and trying to sort of cover all these bases that they were suddenly throwing at us. And it's very much like that with Shenyun. Again, like with Falun Gong, Shenyun's been in existence, it was formed in 2006.
18 years.
18 years. And now, after all that time, in the last 6-8 months, this new campaign achieves laser focus and much more visibility and scope and scale in the West. So I hadn't thought of that, but yeah, it very much does feel that way.
How do you find the energy to keep up the fight for 25 years?
You ask very good questions, Levi. There are a couple things that come to mind. First of all, this has always been very personal for me. And I don't mean like in a vendetta kind of way. I mean sort of like, because my story was, I was in this small software company, a startup. It was me and 8, 9 guys. We were in this little startup company in 1998 in New York. We were working 7 days a week. We're there. We're just sort of like a bunch of friends. And one of my best friends was Chinese. And he goes back to Beijing, visits his family every year. And he came back and, we noticed he was sort of different. He's like helping people around the office. And he's sort of like, he's kind of chill. I was like, so I remember we walked around, we had his desk, and a couple of us kind of went around his desk and we're like, all right, dude, what are you doing? What's going on with you? He's like, yeah, my mom taught me this Falun Gong thing, right? And so he taught us this exercise and meditation practice, and we started doing it. And so for me, that was the introduction. There was no persecution. There was none of this stuff. And so my first introduction to Falun Gong was what it was for me personally, which was something that was, the first impression was something that really brought, it's hard to describe. It's like harmony to the body. It was like suddenly everything that was a little bit off or what, didn't feel quite right. It was just sort of this, that feeling when you go to the gym, an hour and a half, hardcore workout, take your shower, you walk out the door, the mind is clear, right? You're just sort of like, yeah. It was like that all the time when I was practicing Falun Gong. And then when we delved into the teachings, it was like very profound stuff, but stuff that's also practical, in terms of kind of big picture issues, karma, reincarnation, things, and also just smaller sort of day-to-day stuff, like ways to sort of be a better person. I'd always been a little bit frustrated with sometimes with my temper or various parts of my personality, but it was never something I could quite break through. It was always just, that was who I was. And this was sort of, it gave me a blueprint to kind of like be the person I always wanted to be. And so here I am with this thing that was like making my body feel great, was giving me sort of the moral courage and the energy to be the person I wanted to be. And suddenly, everyone who's doing what I'm doing in China is now being thrown in a prison camp or, taken away to be tortured. And I was just sort of, the injustice of that was what started me on this. And it still is to today. But the secondary thing I would say is, because I'm not in a prison in China, I'm not in imminent danger of that happening. But almost from the beginning, starting with my friend's mom, but all the way through to today and now my sons, it had been a situation of physical danger ranging all the way up to risk of death or even death for people I know or loved ones I know. And so there had always been that motivation to sort of like, we can't let that happen. And so I think those two things have, at least for me, have been the pillars I've stood on to focus on this and work on this thing all these years, and why I feel it's so important. I guess in talking, I think there's a third thing, and I think it's almost like the deception in this can't stand. And I don't just mean saying bad things about victims that aren't true. That's bad. But it's sort of like this whole idea that the Chinese regime could try and convince the whole world that people, for as far as I can tell, are some of the best people I know, are evil or weird or something. And everything that flows from that. And so there was sort of this deceptive part of it that I just found so wrong and kind of hit me in a place where it's like, that can't stand. You can't have people, aside from the persecution, aside from, going after people that are engaged in the same spiritual practice I am, this sort of worldwide deception that someone who has nothing to do with Falun Gong, they're not, impacted on that, or they've never seen Shenyun, they've known that. They're just sitting in their living room and they can pick up a paper and say, oh, these people are a cult. And he goes his whole life thinking that. That was like, no, we can't have that.
Why does that bother you so much?
It bothers me, I think, because I believe that what you do matters both to yourself and the universe. Meaning, I have a belief in the basic principles, I guess you could say, of karma. That if you do something really good, that kind of comes back to you. And you do something bad, that kind of comes back to you. What goes around comes around, as we say in the West. There's a real truth to that. And you can get very metaphysical with that. You could also get very, very basic, sort of mundane, every day. There's real truth to that. Sure. Instant karma, yeah. And I think everybody in some flavor believes that. You know, we teach our kids to be good, to not harm others. I mean, you see that in cultures all around the world, and I think there's a real truth to that. Okay, so back to this guy who's never heard of Falun Gong or Shenyun or anything like that. He picks up a paper and says, oh, these people are a cult. And he goes around his life thinking that, and perhaps at some point acting on it. Even if it's a small decision. Maybe he works at a university and there was going to be a Falun Gong group that was going to come and give a talk about what's happening in China, and he goes, no, I'm not going to allow that. Yesterday you were an innocent American person sitting on your couch reading a paper. Today, you're now complicit in this whole thing. And I think that is not just a theoretically bad thing, that's actually incurring karma. And if the lie is big and bad enough and it affects so many people, what are they doing to themselves? That's what bothers me about it. It's sort of like it's trying to convince the world to be bad people or at least be complicit in something that's really horrific. And to no fault of their own. This guy on the couch did nothing wrong besides pick up a paper and read the wrong information. And yet, where's that going to take him in his life? And, you know, if he's someone of consequence, maybe he's a policymaker in some government somewhere. And now he's making policy about what we may or may not do with the Chinese regime and how that will affect the people that the Chinese regime is persecuting. Maybe he's involved in a business and he's investing in parts of China that is buying equipment from the military industrial complex there or supporting their firewalls so that they can track down Falun Gong people. Again, an innocent American yesterday who had done nothing wrong on this front, and today he's doing something wrong. And that strikes me as really bad, because now we're not talking, you know, the human rights abuses are awful, and that's the core reason. But now we're talking about sort of a persecution that kind of touches everybody in a certain way, because they sort of go out and do things against what, if they understood the situation, they wouldn't, and creating bad karma for themselves, to put it directly. And so that's why I feel so strongly about this whole deception of this thing is so wrong, because it kind of pulls everybody in, and the bigger and louder the Chinese regime voice can be, whether they're talking through their state-run media or they're going through these YouTube influencers or seeding some sort of propaganda point that makes its way into the Washington Post or the Wall Street Journal or something, that's affecting all these people. And I find that very disturbing, the fact that that kind of deception could be allowed and the impact it would have on people.
So how would you recommend that people sitting there with the newspaper online in the era of fake news and fake social media accounts and don't know who to believe, where do they go? How do they find out an approximation to their best ability of the truth?
Yeah, that's a tough question. I think the answer is, one is a common sense answer. If you see something weird about Falun Gong and Shenyun, it's probably wrong. But more importantly, I think, is for stories like this, I think it's important to go back and learn the truth. And okay, so what is the truth? Usually you can find the truth on something, a person, a topic, a group of people, an organization, before there was a vested political or economic interest in telling the story one way or the other. Mm-hmm. Go back, if you want to know what Falun Gong is, go back and learn what were they like in the 90s, when the Chinese regime wasn't gunning for them, when none of this was an issue, they were just a bunch of people practicing meditation in a park. What was the story then? Go back to before they were famous, in other words. You know, and I think it's to some extent it's true with people. Go back to before they ran for office or became famous or whatever. What are they as real people? I think it's the same with organizations, it's the same with groups of people. Go back and look at Falun Gong in the 90s. What was it? That's what Falun Gong is. Before anybody had a vested interest in telling the story one way or the other. Understand that story and use that story as the metric that you measure anything else you hear later on. The same with Shenyun. Go back and look at their story before all this stuff started hitting. Understanding that the Chinese regime was gunning for you guys.
From the beginning.
From the beginning. Yeah. But look at the Western, I mean, because with Shenyun, it's a little bit easier because, you know, there's 18 years of governors, mayors, members of Congress who've all seen the show and are praising it and saying it's wonderful. Republicans, Democrats, socialists, all kinds of people out there, not just in the US and Canada, all around Europe and particularly Asia, particularly Taiwan, right? You go to Taiwan, ethnically Chinese, culturally Chinese, the language is Chinese, and they absolutely love Shenyun. You know, well, you guys spend what, a month there?
6 weeks usually.
6 weeks.
Yeah, usually it's like 42 shows all sold out. People from China fly out to see it.
Yeah. Go back and look at the story of Shenyun in the West then and see what all these people are saying and say, and then ask yourself, could all these people, entire countries, places like Taiwan, be talking about Shenyun one way if the truth of what some of these influencers now in the last 6 or 8 months are saying was even remotely true? And I think you got to go back to the core of the story before people had a vested interest, before the propaganda hit a high pitch. What's the real story? And then use that to measure what you're reading, because it's going to just get, like most things these days, my guess is it's just going to get crazier and crazier. And if you don't have some sort of measurement of the truth on a story, on a person or a group, you're just going to get lost in the noise of what social media has become and what it is becoming more and more, particularly when it's in the hands of agents that have been weaponized it to go after a group for a very specific political, geopolitical, economic reason, and that's what's happened here. That would be my suggestion. I know it's not a simple answer, but, you know, I think that's what people would need to do.
Have you talked to your sons about the reports? Have they read them?
I've talked to them a little bit about the first report. I haven't talked to them about the second report. You know, they're pretty aware of what's happening. They understand. First of all, Dad was like this guy who's always working on Chinese issues when they were growing up. And so perhaps more than other kids, they were growing up, they were sort of familiar with the Chinese regime. What was new to them, because despite our best efforts, despite the efforts of my dear wife, trying to help them with Chinese school every Sunday and stuff like that, you know, they grew up in the West. And so they knew a heck of a lot more about the Dodgers and the Yankees than they did about the Tang Dynasty. So when they got to Feitian schools, where a lot of the Shenyun artists, you know, train when they're school age, it was a real learning curve on Chinese culture and understanding from the cultural side what had really happened to authentic Chinese culture, why Shenyun and the schools are trying to bring that back, and why that's a value, of universal value to share with people. And so that's been sort of a learning curve. And so that once they've sort of got their minds around that, to answer your question, I have talked to them about some of the stuff in the report, but honestly, some of the stuff they've seen firsthand. You know, I mean, they've been, you know, in the last few years, they've been touring with Shenyun. And so they get to see some of this stuff, and so they know what's happening. Well, particularly it's sort of like the older members of their troupe, the professional, you know, dancers and stuff, talk about when there's a pressure on a theater or things like that. Unfortunately, this last year, we had also a relatively new phenomenon where we got bomb threats. I mean, you guys got...
We got one in Vancouver, but it was the same exact threat as the ones in Costa Mesa, Long Beach, France, Taiwan.
Yeah.
So where were your sons?
My sons were in Europe for the first part, And the bomb threat that went to France, I think they had come stateside by then.
Okay.
But they were in the Orlando theater, when that threat came in.
Right. In fact, this last year, because of the bomb threats, we had sniffing dogs and everything, just making sure we realize that they're bomb threats. But if you're in a theater or you're a performer, you want to make sure 100% it's not the boy who cries wolf, and this time it's for real. So yeah, they go through all the security, make sure. And it was all, I mean, I can't emphasize this enough. They were all sent basically the same verbiage from one or two same accounts. It was just one guy probably just sending these emails out. And they proved to be very vacuous. But yeah, we definitely went through all those measures to make sure.
And so they understand the pressure that the company's on, and they understand why. But again, I think they're not terribly worried. The security's great. With the company, and so it's not like a day-to-day worry of theirs, but they definitely understand why the Chinese regime is gunning for the company, and they have a pretty clear sense of why it's important to get up on that stage every night. And
what do you think drives your boys, your sons, to continue in spite of facing the world's biggest dictatorship?
What I hear from them time and time again are two things. The first is they found their band of brothers. I mean, it's super clear. And that's always been pretty important for both of them. I remember, both of my boys were fairly accomplished baseball players from the time they were young. And so they were on travel teams. And I remember one time sitting down and having a talk with my older son about that, and he mentioned one of the things he loved about baseball was the time in the dugout. He loved the camaraderie of the team as much as he loved the game. And that's something that really drove him. And same with the younger son. And so one of the things that drives them is really just the environment. They love how close, it's sort of like, I try and explain it because we have, these families. When we first moved, we were in New Jersey, and we first moved out. And so all these families and all their old friends are always constantly asking, how's Jesse and Lucas? What are they doing? What's up? And they're always asking me about the school. And I try and, how do you explain it? It's like part Juilliard, part West Point, part summer camp. It's sort of like you put all those together because, and I say that because on the artistic side, they're learning from some of the best in the world in terms of how to do classical Chinese dance. And so the bar is as high as you can get on the artistic side. It's more sort of West Pointy in that there is a real discipline, but it's more like the discipline you see in Asian context. Like if you've ever taken karate, you go in and the respect that you see of the karate master, and you bow when he comes into the room, the discipline that which the karate class is carried out. You get that in a dance class. It's interesting when we go watch their final exams of each semester, right? When they're in school, and all the dancers line up, and the dance teacher comes out. They bow to the dance teacher, they bow to the audience, and then they get started. And so there's this wonderful discipline that they're also learning in the school that I find fascinating. It's really just a shame we've lost a lot of that in the West. See, you still see it a bit of in the East. Like I remember, even in baseball, right? You go to see a Taiwanese baseball game, and the first time up, everybody at the batter's box, they bow to the umpire, right? Yep. And all this stuff. So there's still this sort of this respect and decorum that I think is important in the East in general, and you have that in the dance classes. And so that's all of those things together. They've really found a wonderful band of brothers, and that's really one of the two pillars that drives them. The second is, I think they have a real visceral sense that they're involved in something big. It's not just, hey, let's get up there on stage and show a culture. I think they have a sense that traditional, authentic Chinese culture is quite universal, and it's something that's very uplifting. And they have a sense that it's really important in the world today. Because you look around and, it's getting dicey, in terms of the negativity and the tribal politics and how much people hate each other just because of their opinions don't agree. And there's just a lot of negativity in the world. And they get a clear sense of that. They know that. And I think they see Shenyun as a way to give people something else, to give people a real experience that's uniting. It's sort of showing people, instead of all the ways in which we think differently and we act differently, we our interests are against each other, it's like showing people our common humanity, the good side of it, and the fact that that's something that should be cherished. It's very hopeful. And so, I mean, a lot of times when you go to a Shenyang show, as you know very well, there's often people come out of the theater and they give interviews and say, what did you see in there? And they talk about what the show is like. Well, my boys watch those actually quite often, because you get to see what people experience in the theater, and that's very inspiring. So they have a real sense that they're not just, putting on a show for a fun night. They have a real sense that they're kind of giving people an experience that's very hopeful and that can actually, help them think differently, more positively, can actually touch people, change people's lives. So they get a sense for that. So it's those two things. They're sort of the best of both worlds. They've got this band of brothers they found, and they've got this wonderful mission, which for me, I'll just on a personal level, that was one of the things I always worried. I worried about a lot of stuff as a parent. But growing up, one of the things I worried about, because I see so many kids never kind of finding their thing. They're always they're looking for a group, or they're looking for a skill, or they're looking for something that's theirs. That's sort of, it's a way to like, oh, I belong. I have a purpose. I have a value. And so many kids, I mean, even some of the kids that I grew up with, but sort of in my boys' generation, some kids really floundering. And I think, some of them go off in a bad direction because they didn't find that. And so that was always a concern. Are they going to find their thing? Something that really deep in their heart, it's like, this is why I'm here. This gives my life purpose. And I was afraid they didn't really lock into that. And it was like, so for a while it was baseball, and then it was this, it was that. And when they first started going to Feitian, and then they started being able to tour with Shenyang, it was like, oh, they found it. They found it. And that was a big sigh of relief for me, because I know I had that experience, as a young man, the day I sort of found out what I was going to do and what I wanted. There's something very empowering about it. There's something very fulfilling about it. And to see that in your kids, it's sort of like, great.
What was it like for you seeing them perform for the first time?
Cried like a baby. Oh boy. Still do, actually. Yeah.
Why do you think that is?
Well, if I may say so myself, I'm not a classical Chinese dance expert, but they're both very beautiful to watch. And they're different. One son has this very sort of commanding presence. When I look at him on stage, I'm like, dude, he's not that tall. There's something going on. But like, he has this way of dancing. It's sort of like, especially when he does like a general or something like that, he's like, there's something very commanding about his presence that is remarkable, that he could turn that on. The other one is a little bit different in that he has sort of this bearing to him. I think the word in Chinese is what? Yun. Okay. He has this bearing in it where he brings something very circular and beautiful out when he's dancing. And it's sort of a different energy than the first. And, not to pigeonhole them in those categories, they get better and better at doing different types of dance. But there's something very fluid and circular about the way he dances. And I just sort of like, it's interesting because they're doing the same thing. They were trained in the same thing. They were raised in the same family. They have the same genes, and they get up on stage, and there's a unique strength to each of them. And to see that come out, and through the Shenyang training, to see them be able to do that on stage is sort of like, wow. So that's one thing, is to notice their ability and to exhibit those strengths. But also just on stage, you can see it, what I was talking about, that they found their thing. And it's probably not unlike, watching your kid pitch a first inning for the first time in the major leagues, and that kid's been working all his life to do that. And, I'm sure parents all over the world experience this, but you see a kid find their thing, be able to do it well and love it. It's just, what else could you ask for as a father?